Byrnes. I make Christmas ornaments through a technique called flame working in glass. I'd like to show you how. I'm using a combination of propane and oxygen for my flame. First step is to melt the end of the tube and temporarily tack on a glass rod. That serves as a temporary handle so that I can draw out a long slender point or handle from the tube itself. The tube's of about 1 inch diameter, which is a bit much to provide the dexterity I want. So these long slender handles, or points as I call them, will serve me well for that. Here I'm drawing out that long slender handle. It's important to continue rotating so that handle comes out on axis with the tube as close as I can get it. Now I'm removing that temporary solid handle. The next step, after that first point or handle is cold, cut it open. It had been melted closed. It's now open, so I'll be able to blow in it. The next step is to just make sure that's as well aligned as I can get it in reference to the tube itself before I move on. And now I'm ready to pull the next section. In this case, I'll pull longer because I'm going to form 2 handles in one. It'll be the second handle for this first blank and the first handle for the coming one. I certainly do thin the glass out as I stretch it, so it's important to make sure that you allow enough glass to melt and thicken up in preparation for the stretch. I make a judgment of distance and then separate it in the flame at about the center point. I'm going to use 2 colors for this ornament, a ruby red and a white. What I'm doing now is to just straighten that second handle to make sure it's aligned with the first handle, which, as you'll recall, was aligned with the tube itself when I had that opportunity. Sequence is kind of important. You don't want to end up with a short section of glass that has a crooked handle on both ends. Drive yourself nuts trying to get that straight. Now I switched it around, making sure that the open end, one end is cut open, the other is melted closed. And I want to make sure that the open end is in my right hand, because that's the side I'll be blowing in. It's not real productive to blow into the end that's melted shut, as you can imagine. Hot glass glass doesn't stick to cold glass, so it's important to warm up the substrate before applying the color. I'm wearing a filtered lens that makes it a little easier for me to see than it is for you on the video. It's exactly what I'm doing. If you get the right amount of heat in the right place, you can lay that colored glass on almost like drawing a line with a pencil. To the best of my judgment, I'm endeavoring to split the tube into 4 sections there, evenly spaced on a good day. The spacing is important on this one because I'm going to do, there'll actually be 16 stripes of color. After I get the first 4 white on, I'll split that with more white, and then I'll fill in the spaces between with red, so everything fits better if I get the spacing pretty even. The glass itself is not a good conductor of heat at all, so my hands are not getting warm from any radiant or conduction in the glass itself. It's just the heat coming off the fire warms my fingertips a little bit at times and dictates where I can hold things. There's probably less heat coming off the fire than you would imagine too, though. The flow of fuel tends to keep the heat fairly concentrated in the flame. This red that I'm applying now is what's called a striking color. It begins as a nice ruby red color. As I melt it, it becomes transparent. And through subsequent heating cycles throughout the making of the ornament, it will vary from red back to clear again, and it will look blotchy red at times. Ultimately, when the ornament is done, I'll flame treat it, and it will mostly, as they say, strike back to a nice ruby red, and you'll see that. There's also an ornament finish that's been through in a annealing oven, and that's where it truly strikes back to a bold ruby red. After I get all the color on there, I'll reheat that entire section and begin to twist. The design I'm doing is called a finesse, and it has a squared off flattened top, and so I'm just initiating that now. I'll be making efforts to maintain that throughout the process. Here I'm warming the entire color area, getting it up to a point of malleability so I can just create a little bit of twist in it. I don't want to melt it now. Just want to get it malleable. When I feel the temperature's right, I'll simply start rotating my left hand a little faster than my right to initiate the twist. You can create a twist lots of ways. You can stop rotating with one hand or twist in opposite directions with each hand, but I find this the most controlled. In twisting it, sometimes I'll create some creases and a little puff of air will blow them out. I want to get it back to a nice clean cylinder before I begin the rest of the design. Continuing to maintain that flattened top. Now I'm melting to form a neck section on the top section of this ornament. Similar to when I drew out these temporary slender handles that I'm holding, I'll heat and let the glass melt before I stretch, so as not to thin it out too much in the course of stretching. Although the diameter of the tube is much diminished in that area, the thickness of the wall is about the same throughout that whole area. After each step, it's important to continue rotating, maintain things on a nice axis. Now I'm going to do similarly again, heat a section, make sure it melts enough, thickens up a little bit, and then I'll stretch. This is going to be a longer stretch this time. Just about feeling ready. And here we go. Have to be careful at this point not to untwist the twist I've created on purpose. Now the tubular section between those two stretched areas will be blown up into a cylinder initially, or excuse me, a sphere, but then I'll be heating and squeezing to develop that into more of a disc shape. The blowing gets a lot of attention, but as you'll see, it's not a dominant part of the process. And if you're wondering, you don't have to blow very hard. Now I've formed that into more of a disc shape. When that stabilizes, I'll be applying some clear glass beads all around the outer surface. I like to do a lot of this sort of thing on my work to add surface area. It seems to make them sparkle better in the light. Ornaments where I have fewer stripes of color, I put clear stripes in between the color stripes for the same reason. I like to add a lot of texture. applying with my right hand, if you look at the end opposite the flame, you'll notice it glowing very bright at times. That's light traveling along the length of the rod and escaping out the end, which is the idea of how optic fiber cable works. As glass beads go on cold, that's obviously a relative term, but after I get them on there, I'll play them in the flame to make sure they're melted in good. Now I'm going to add a feature in that upper neck section. This feature is formed mostly by heating a narrow band and squeezing, but there's some risk of creating a crease if I just squeeze, so I give a little puff of air in there to open things up. And that feature gives me an excuse for more glass beads. Everything's back on a nice axis. Now I'll go ahead and one more time square up the top of this ornament. What I'm doing now is heating the area above the color. I'll stretch it out a little bit, but mostly I'm letting it melt and collapse down. Not all the way closed, it's still going to remain hollow throughout. Now that I have that crown on the top formed, it gives me another place for more clear glass beads. Making sure they're all melted in well. This larger flame is actually colder and more diffuse, and it helps soften the strain rings resulting from working in a very small space with a very hot fire. Now I'll switch things around and shape up the bottom end of this ornament. I'm going to collapse the area, in this case below the color, similar to the top but not as extremely. I'm making sure the glass is nice and thick at that spot because that's where I'm ultimately going to close the ornament, seal it up. Now, right at the terminus of the color, I'll heat a narrow band and squeeze to form a sharp edge there, and that will give me another place to put some more clear glass beads. And then we'll kind of tie it in design-wise with what's going on up at the top of the ornament too. Making sure they're melted in well. Now I'm cutting the end open. At this point, both ends are now open, and that's fine because I'm done blowing, so I don't need to trap air anymore. What I'm going to do next is form the loop that the ornament will hang from. The loop is solid glass, and I could certainly pull off that hollow handle and add solid glass, but I find it more expeditious just to melt that hollow handle down into a solid mass and draw the loop out of that. What you see me do now is I'm branding the ornament, you might say, with a maker's mark. That steel rod has my initials carved in the end of it. So when I'm done, I just soften the surface of the glass at the base of the loop and press my initials in. Now I've sealed on a temporary handle to the top of the loop. This allows me to rotate the whole ornament into flame, getting it not to the point where it would melt. As I say, this big fire is not as hot a fire, but it's more than enough to draw drive out any moisture from in the ornament. Because I am going to seal it closed, there'll be no hole in it. It's very important that you drive the moisture out before sealing it up. This step, this reheating, also tends to cause that ruby red to strike back to its natural color. I think you can see that a little better now than earlier in the process. And now I'm ready to draw that second handle off and seal the ornament up. Final step, when the ornament's cold, I'll handle the ornament itself and remove that temporary handle I had sealed onto the loop. Pick away any excess there. And now we're truly finished. Thanks for watching.